Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Culture Clash podcast, where Russian-American consultants discuss and debate some of the hot news topics in the news from the recent weeks. So I'm Michael.
I'm Vlad. Hello, everyone.
And today we have a very special episode. We have three guests, all from our office in Dubai, where we have 50 consultants, 25 different nationalities. We brought three of the nationalities here today to have a discussion around what the impact American foreign policy is going to have on the wider world, their individual regions, and unpack that. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Paul Green.
Yeah, hi, I'm Paul. I got a PhD in European politics and British, and living here in Dubai.
And then Gibson Ateng.
Gibson Ateng. I'm Kenyan, traveled across 26 African countries, very passionate about Africa.
And then Dr. Khaled Al-Marachli.
Khaled, also part of our esteemed organization. I have a PhD in political economy and a PhD in business studies.
American foreign policy is clearly changing. Why is it happening from your all's diverse and varied perspectives? Is it only Donald Trump, or do you think this is a permanent U.S. change? Who wants to tackle that one first?
I can start.
Go for it, Dr. Khaled.
Well, actually, this question has been a very hot topic recently. From my perspective, I don't think there's any president that can radically deviate from the overarching strategic direction in the U.S. And we need to differentiate, actually, between the political rhetoric of Trump and between what he realistically can do on the ground, can implement. To clarify, we need to understand very well how the governance and policy work in the U.S., actually. There's this highly sophisticated and complex network of institutions composing a very coherent governance bureaucratic framework. Those institutions do not allow actually the president really to do whatever comes into his mind.
Are we talking about the deep state in this case?
We call it the deep state actually, but the deep state, from my perspective, is not this secret organization that's running the show from behind the scenes.
They don't have meetings. It's just
no. It's this network of institutions. We can start with the Congress, with its bicameral composition, where policies and decisions could easily be blocked. We are talking about the intelligence agencies, like CIA, for example, where data and information resides. And we know that where information resides, there is power. We have, for example, the Pentagon, that can also push back on decisions that actually are related to drastic military withdrawals or engagements. We have the Department of State that also has a significant say in shaping and driving the foreign and internal strategy. We have the National Security Council that is staffed inside the White House around the president. So it's very difficult for the president in the United States to bypass this checks and balances system. Having said that doesn't mean that it's 100% immune or is flawless. At some point, it needs to interfere to hold President Trump's horses. We've all seen what happened recently in the past couple of days in the stock market. S&P 500, for example, it dropped by 2.7%. Dow Jones dropped by 2.1%. Same for NASDAQ. Also, Wall Street was experiencing significant turmoil resulting from the growing fears of investors as a result of the aggressive tariff policy composed by President Trump. So back to the root, the basic question, to our root question. I don't think the president can radically deviate from the strategic direction. There is, of course, a margin that the president could influence or could impact this strategic policy, but there is a mechanism to recover and actually to create this equilibrium or balance. So I think at some point we will be witnessing more and more interventions from this deep state that we talked about.
So you would say it's more permanent change driven by the institutions as opposed to Donald Trump, the personality?
Yeah,
from your perspective.
I think, and I don't think it's that big to the extent that we imagine. Like certainly there is a change in the strategic direction. Like if we look at the GDPs, we can understand where things are going. Like if we look at GDP, we start with the United States, which is around 29 trillion. The second one is China, which is 18 to 19 trillion. And then the third one is Japan, 4 trillion. So you can understand that the focus in the coming period would be actually competing severely. I don't want to use the word like some very tough words like inflicting a war or something.
You don't want to use the words, but you just did.
Maybe it's going to.
Look, I'm American. I agree with you.
So I think there will be a major focus on China.
Yeah,
I think this is a good point that Khaled makes actually about the economies, because you're talking about, is what's happening right now, is it driven by Trump? But then you think about what's been going on for the last, you think about what's going on for the last 20 years. You go back to sort of the days of, Reagan and Clinton, and you think about where China was and where Europe was and where America was then in terms of the size of their economies, the militaries, the relative power that they had. And then you think about where it is now. I mean, it's vastly different. I mean, I was looking at the numbers as well in terms of how China's, I know the last 5 years, just so we were talking about this, weren't we, Mike? The last 5 years, China and US have been growing sort of at the same pace. But when you widen it out and you look at it relativistically, the change is massive. So you think about, what Elon Musk is saying now, coming out and saying, why don't we just get out of NATO in the US? What's the point? I mean, I'm thinking to myself, why weren't we asking that question 10 years ago? I mean, how's it taken this long?
Yeah.
When you think about how the tectonic plates of the global economics and geopolitics and military powers shifted over the last 30 years, it's nowhere near where it was, when these institutions were set up, when NATO was set up and so on. So, yeah, I mean, I think Trump's sort of he's like the tipping point, if you like, the catalyst. He's come in and he's an agent of change anyway, because he's that sort of guy and he wants to shake things up. But, he's shaking things up that really he's just sort of, reflecting what's already kind of happened.
I was going to say, Paul, you sound like a British Donald Trump at this point. I mean, that's, but look, I think it's very interesting, and I think we're going to go much deeper into that particular question and topic. Gibson, any thoughts? Anything comes to your mind straight away? I don't want to put you on the spot, but you're in the middle seat, so.
I have a very different view in terms of whether there's been a change at all, and maybe this comes from an African perspective, right? Because the question itself presumes that there's been a change in terms of policy towards African countries. I think the only difference is that this current regime is saying the quiet part loud. Where I think that American policy in the past, as regards Africa, has always been the same. So when someone talks about the current American strategy, I think you're talking about America first. I don't think there's ever been a time, at least from an African perspective, where America has thought of Africa as a partner. They've thought of Africa as the place to get resources from, right? They've never thought of Africa as a partner. They've thought of Africa as a shithole country. He is only saying it now, but I would argue that all past regimes, all past American presidents have thought it and have simply been tactful in the way that they've treated Africa. But I don't think I would say that there's an American regime that has treated Africa as a partner. So in that sense, there hasn't been a policy change, say. It's just the way it is being articulated. I'm a firm believer that that the policy remains the same. It's only the competence of the people that are implementing it that gives a different view from the perspective of the person who's on the receiving end of that policy. And I think that's very much what's happening with the US. We are in a situation where people are starting to look at other alternatives and are thinking maybe the US is not really a partner for us. Maybe we should be looking to other countries like China because they are transactional. Yes, they are, but we can see the tangible benefits of their involvement in the African continent.
This is a very important point, by the way, raised by Gibson. The global governance is changing. So there is a parallel governance framework. It's invisible at the moment, but it exists. The United Nations have become more passive, less active.
You mean
So-
useless?
Almost.
Okay.
We could argue it always was,
Yeah.
but this is
So there is a multipolarity coming up from the economic perspective. You have the BRICS, which consists of huge economic powers, countries who are seeking de-dollarization. And I would really call this a serious threat for the American domination over the global economy. So there are some global factors that are certainly changing and could actually cause a major shift in powers, an imminent shift in powers. This could have actually influenced the existing like U.S. direction, and maybe this is why what we call again the deep state actually is allowing Donald Trump to practice his preferred approach. Because those global changing, maybe they require the phase requires someone like Donald Trump. I think the American, I don't want to use the word deep state anymore. The American system actually
You're very diplomatic.
has different faces for different phases. So the phase now actually requires to them someone like Donald Trump, considering the challenges. However, he's overdoing it, like following a skeptical approach towards your ally and being to your allies and being open towards your adversaries. It sounds a little bit weird. It sounds a little bit not familiar. Like to me, it's a little bit surprising. The way the U.S. is dealing with the European Union.
But do you think it's a
countries, for
problem?
example.
I mean, is this something that we should be?
I think it's a major.
Why do you think that?
I think because there are always there's always a diplomatic protocol that actually, if not influencing the official decision makers in countries, but they certainly impact the populations of those countries. And for example, when Donald Trump, when this meeting happened between Donald Trump and Zelensky, it might
had a
be
long conversation about
it
that,
Might,
yeah.
it might be something, a kind of folklore, by the way. But we need to think how Ukrainians looked at it. For Ukrainians, this is an insult to their national identity. So, and this is the side that is not being carefully looked at following this approach.
I mean, so to come back to Gibson's point and to pick up on what you're saying there with Ukraine. So, I mean, if I was hearing what you were saying, Gibson, and in a sense, there's nothing new here. You know, Trump and America behind them, they've always treated Africa terribly. And I mean, I'm British, but I live in South Africa, so I sort of, you know, my family's there, so I get to see it a little bit firsthand as well. And I'd kind of agree with that. But then I'd expand that out and say, you know, that's the same with everything we see going on right now. So if you take Ukraine and Russia, I mean, what America was doing 4 years ago kind of makes sense. It was in America's interest because they had to learn a few things. They had to sort of stabilize that situation, not let it get out of hand. Not in their interest anymore. You know, that's been learned and won. Now their interest is something different. So, you know, I don't see that America particularly, and I think this is the point you were making, Gibson, I don't think they're not being inconsistent. They're being consistent in just focusing on what happens to be in their interest at any point in history, which is why it's like now they're saying, now we're hearing the calls about NATO. You know, why are we spending all this money on NATO? It's the same thread that we can see going everywhere. And to come back to the question, I would say it's not Trump isn't creating this. He's just a mouthpiece right now. The things that have been happening, that have been going on globally, have been happening for a long time to change where the balance of interest is. And Trump is now he's the megaphone that's just saying, you know, because he doesn't have a filter. And we know that about him. He's just coming out and saying, look, this is the way it is, guys. Let's get on with it. You know, this is the reality. So
Did you say megaphone or magaphone?
I think it was a bit of both.
He said just a big mouth, I guess.
Big mouth.
Yeah, all of the above.
You know.
I agree with this point. I like the idea that like nothing is new under the sun, actually, because you know, like if you look again at the Russian-American relations for recent 20-25 years, there were ups and downs, and it was like in the same way. Like Russia was considered as like not number one, never number one, like number three enemy, or it was considered as someone potential junior partner or something like that. Remember, like when they started this reload in the relations, but you guys couldn't.
When Hillary Clinton messed up the word for,
that's what I wanted to say. You couldn't write the word correctly, so you wrote overload instead of reload.
We're not very good at foreign languages, I think, as everybody knows. Americans are
right. Yeah. So I mean, there were ups and downs, and basically now we can see like some slight change in the dynamics, like in the recent just 2 weeks. And again, what I firmly believe is like when we look at what Trump says and does, it doesn't necessarily like we don't know what is the reality. I totally agree with Khalid's point that like what we see on stage, what we see on screen, and what is happening behind the scenes, like we have no idea. And I like when you mentioned this, but we need to treat and understand Trump seriously, but not literally. And I think what a lot of people are doing is they consider him very literally. And this is a huge mistake. And I like this quote, actually.
But I think what we don't want to escape from is that, yes, a lot of what Trump says is serious, but he is always I would say that we need to take him literally, because some of the things, if gone unbridled, Trump is very capable of doing. So in as much as I've said that there is no change in policy, especially from an African perspective, there is a change in the way people are receiving.
That's true.
How this policy is being articulated. If you look,
that's for sure. Change in communication, in messaging, in rhetoric.
Yeah, this is a very important point. Like if it's only about Trump himself, we understand the character and the background of President Trump. But the thing is, this time he's surrounded with people who are mimicking him, like people who are following his approach. So there is no balance, no equilibrium. Like he brought, like to the Ministry of Defense, for example, he brought someone with no political background. Without any political background.
You said he brought his ex?
No, he's got a few ex-wives. I don't think he brought them to the Defense Department. I wouldn't put it past him, though. It's possible. But I don't think he dated Pete Hegseth. I highly doubt that.
Yeah. For example, if we look at J.D. Vance in lecturing literally the European countries, this approach actually is very new. I agree that the American foreign policy is consistent, because actually Kissinger has said it, that we have no friends. America first. This is not new, and it's their right. Actually, it's the right of any country to try to maintain and sustain power. But it's very critical how America is addressing the world at the moment. I don't see that this will lead to any positive.
And if I can just point out a few things that are changing in Africa. Think about the Sahel countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, and which is the other country where we are seeing a lot of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, right? Severing ties from France, because you have this. I think there's something simmering in Africa. Think about the Gen Z protests in Nigeria, in Kenya, where they were really hopeful that there was going to be changes in their lives because of the political institutions that are coming into play. So we had elections in Ghana, we had elections in Kenya, and the young people were really hopeful that things were going to change. And then we had a situation where these leaders are aligning with the US specifically. Think about Kenya. I think within the first couple of months since he was elected, he took a flight to the States, and he was actually called the flying president, and did nothing about the economic situation at home. And there were protests for a couple of months that in fact led to withdrawal of the finance bill, because it was really just tax, and people thought that this is not good for us. So what's the alternative? So if you look at the policies and how they're playing out in Africa, and you see who it is benefiting most, I think the perception is that the Americans are very paternalistic in their policies. They're very moral, right? There's a lot of hooks to the aid that they give. Think about withdrawal of the USAID funding. But is that really helping the person on the ground? On the other hand, you have China with the bridge and road initiatives, where you're seeing lots of investments in infrastructure, and that is ultimately what matters to the Kenyan, the African, right? That when we were aligned to the US and most of the Western countries.
I remember I was talking with one of the farmers in Kenya. I met him like just by chance, and he said, when Americans come, we get the lecture about our rights. When Chinese come, we get a hospital.
And that's exactly why. And as an American, and not only that, but a Donald Trump supporting American.
So now you're open about it.
Yeah, I'll admit it. I think it was maybe obvious in the tone and everything else and how I would talk about it, but I think we're all saying similar things. I think it's a bit of a breath of fresh air from that perspective, in that I think I totally agree with everything you said, Gibson, how the U.S. is, how we've conducted foreign policy, the lecturing, the condescension. We don't need any of that. I don't think it does anybody any good. I think it's hypocritical, and I think it engenders a lot of, frustration with the U.S. I know I feel it if I see, for example, what we did in Iraq, if I see, what we did in Afghanistan, and then we want to lecture people about X, Y, and Z, it rubs me the wrong way, and I think it rubs a lot of people the wrong way. So the question then becomes, does that then impact actual foreign policy? Are there tangible impacts on the ground by insulting people in some cases? The Ukrainian example. But the one thing I would say is I do think America has a very long leash to be able to get away with some of that. And because we were diplomatic for so long, I don't think any of these things will have the massive ramifications that maybe people are worried about. Like suddenly everybody's going to gang up against the U.S., everybody's going to go flock to China. If America offers a viable alternative in Africa, do you not think that maybe the U.S. can keep its alliances and keep its relationships?
I doubt that they can. Think about the difference.
You said you doubt that they can.
I doubt that they can. The Bridge and Road Initiative started in 2013. There's been a consistent messaging for more than a decade that this is what China wants. We're not going to interfere in your local politics. We are going to come and invest in major infrastructure. We are going to invest in electricity, in dams. Think about Ethiopia. Think about Tanzania, the ports, right? Of course, there's all this talk about how all these African countries are going to become debt dependent. But ultimately, it is affecting the economic. I think there's better distribution of the GDP in the way that China espouses its policy. And there's a consistent messaging over more than 10 years that makes that message more palatable in Africa. But for the US, you can't predict what's going to happen, right? In 4 years' time, there's going to be a change in messaging. Will they be funding USAID so that initiatives for diseases like AIDS can be mitigated? I don't think anybody wants that kind of inconsistency. So I think by default, people are going to will start leaning towards China.
I think that's an important point as well, because the last 30, 40, there's only been the US. That's the point, right? There's not been another country that could afford to do the kinds of things on a global scale that the US was doing. Again, coming back to South Africa, I see in South Africa the AIDS program funded by the US, several $billion. Nobody else could stump up that kind of money, But now, with all that pulling out, and there's a bit of a vacuum that's been created, there is a country, there is someone that can stump up that kind of money.
But to me, that's the question: is China the answer? Do they have the capability, the finances, and all of that?
I wouldn't say that they're their answer, but I think they are the elephant in the room behind a lot of what's going on right now. Why does the US even feel that it needs to start rebalancing where it's spending its money? Because for the last, since the fall of the Soviet Union, there hasn't been a great power threat to the US. It just hasn't been there. There's been one player globally since the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, with respect to
Why
my
am I
Russian
the
friend,
Soviet guy?
you know,
his mother country, sorry to
they
mention
always-
the.
They always associate you with the Soviet Union.
well, look, I'm
Well,
British.
he's a
so
Soviet.
I'm British. I know how it feels to be.
That's true. Two
to be a
fallen
fallen-
empires here in the same table. That's hopefully mine will be the third.
We're
but,
in the same camp, yeah. But you know what I mean. And now it's completely different. So I see it as well in South Africa. I see Chinese businesses starting up locally in the small town where my home is. There ain't no Americans around. That's for sure.
You know, Michael, this reminds me with the idea that we were discussing last time, and the thing that we call actually the strategic hubris. Hubris is the Latin word that stands for states being overconfident and arrogant. So the assumption that no one can compete, no one has the capability, no one is capable, this is where states start falling, actually. So we need to be very careful. If I would be an American, I would be very careful using those terms addressing the world, because things are changing.
Sorry, have I offended anybody at the table? Was that directed at me?
No. Actually, no. It's not actually.
No, but I hear you.
But China could seriously be a very tough competitor.
Yeah, especially when you look at projections. You look at projections, I mean, we think right now, but you look at the forecast for the next 10, 15 years. Okay, the forecast, but still, if I'm in the US, I'm looking at them and thinking, I better pay attention.
To that point, that summarizes for me, this is part of why I support Donald Trump, honestly, is I think that dynamic, the US-China rivalry, is so important and is the defining geopolitical challenge, I think, in the current time. So in order for the U.S. to be prepared for that challenge, what does it need to do? I would argue that the U.S. needs to be less focused on Europe. So that's essentially what Donald Trump's view has been, a bit of NATO skepticism, a bit of trying to cozy back up to Russia, and trying to be a bit more, what's the word, but middle ground when it comes to some of these relationships, reevaluate some of these relationships. Of course, the U.S. obviously has a huge amount of debt as well, which is a big problem. That's sort of the sword hanging over our necks. So if it means repositioning, changing your global alliance network to then focus on this rising competition with China, to me, I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think all of his initiatives, whether it's this Doge, I don't want to get off the foreign policy topic, but I think basically the trade wars, these things, I think this has a capacity to deal more damage to China than it would to the U.S. So yeah, that's why I think I'm more comfortable with that approach as opposed to the previous approach. But again, I think to your point, who knows? Maybe the Chinese are able to mount a viable threat. But
Gibson has mentioned a very important point. This unpredictability of the U.S. foreign policy will lead actually to losing confidence and trust for U.S. allies. So when we think about China, we also have to think about the possibility of coalitions and like new alliances that could cooperate against the U.S. geopolitical and global economical policy.
do you have any in mind?
Of course, like if we look at Russia, for example, we cannot, although there is a war that I believe that it has exhausted Russia, it is still considered a powerful country. It's a nation. So we have India. We cannot underestimate India. We cannot underestimate even, and this could sound a little bit weird, the European Union, who was actually a little bit passive recently, but because of the United States' new approach, they started thinking about rebuilding their, I cannot call it national identity, but they're repositioning the European countries, investing more in their military industry, military sector, because they lost this confidence. They lost trust.
Man, you sound exactly like Vlad with the EU stuff. I get it. I think they are a competitor, theoretical, but we've had this conversation ad nauseum. I just don't really see it. I don't think the Europeans can unite. 27, 28 countries agree on a common cause, agree on a common military, fight battles together, have the same strategy. Within Europe alone, you've got Hungary who wants to pull out of the sanctions against Russia. You got Slovakia that's questioning it. The far right in Germany, the far right ascendant in the UK and France. You see that as a competitor?
But it's happening. That's the point, Michael. Like we're saying, we say we don't see it, but it's happening. Like look at Germany. Look at the budget they allocated for the military growth. Look at the attempts going on between France, Germany to enforce. Not to enforce, actually, to empower the European Union again. And
I agree. I agree. I think, it's the old expression, necessity is the mother of invention, right? So, I agree, Michael. Europe, they've been fighting each other for 1,000 years and, it's the way it is. But, they've always had for the last 50, 60 years, 70 years, the US to sort of carry the butt back for them. They've never had to face up to the situation. It is different now. They have to. It looks like the way the cards are being played, they're going to have no choice here. So I agree with what we're saying here. They when they have to step up, when there's no other choice, I think they will. And the other thing I would say as well is, we talk about, everything that's happening right now and Trump this and he's a bully and he's being unfair to his partners and he's disrespecting relationships. There's a saying that, the one person who's in a room who shouts the loudest looks the weakest. This does not look to me like American strength that's playing out right now. To talking about, to the point about China, and sort of dismissing that, I actually think the way America's behaving is actually giving, shining a light on just how almost fearful to an extent, the American view of what's happening in China actually is. And I think that's why they're doing it. Otherwise, if that wasn't the case or there wasn't some other threat, then that would beg the question, well, why do anything? Why change anything then? If, what's the driving force?
I think that's a brilliant point, Paul. And to Doctor's point about Michael not seeing the wider
which
picture.
doctor?
That's very typical. That's very typical.
Yeah,
of a
you're
Trump
in between
supporter.
two doctors.
But I think.
Oh, so sorry. Go. What was that? What was that Trump supporter comment, Gibson?
No, I just feel that it's the norm for Trump supporters not to see what's actually happening on the ground, and Dr. Khalil is clearly articulating that there's something happening on the ground that is a direct result of American policy, and a Trump supporter is refuting that, while it is very clear to everybody else to see.
Gibson, real quick, you're citing the doctor as if that's a reference point. His PhD is in gender studies. You're aware of that, right?
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I'm just being respectful out of. But the point is this, Michael, that I think whatever the US does now is it's probably too late, right? I think the world is so interconnected to the point that starting to have an inward focus or an isolationist policy is just not going to help the United States. I think that ship's it.
This is such an interesting dynamic. I feel like this table is summarizing what's happening in the world.
But you know what? I'm gonna cheer you up a little bit. There is a bright side for it.
Dude, I don't need to be cheered up. I don't agree with you guys. I think you guys are all wrong.
In some regions,
wrong.
In some regions, actually, the good part of the new direction is that they are addressing loose ends that occurred during the Biden's administration. For example, in the Middle East, it's obvious that there are things getting settled. So, there is a sort.
Syria being a good example.
Like Syria, even Lebanon, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is going to have a settlement soon. So in general, there is if we look at the Middle East, so I think the U.S. interest at the moment is to have this region stable a little bit, maybe for the same purpose that they want really to focus on their competition or economic struggle with China. But for the Middle East, I think stability is a good thing.
I mean, definitely for us, we live here, right? So we don't want to. We don't want to see any issues.
So just to to cheer
So
you up
you
a little
cheered me
bit.
up by saying our houses aren't going to be
in the Middle East.
threat.
We're
Dr. Khalid, PhD in gender studies. I don't know if that cheered me up all that much. I mean, I wasn't anticipating conflict anyway, but fair enough. Fair enough. Did you want to say something, Soviet?
Yeah, I agree with this point, because like it looks like for the recent, I don't know, several years, with too much of the external orientation, the basically what, like, if you look at the US, like probably like they realize that they're now too stretched. And not only the US, I think, like, again, same what I always say about Russia. Russia also like has the mission to build like the like Slavic world or whatever, like different ideologies about this. But honestly, guys, like, look inwards, like focus inwards. Like, you have so much potential inside the country, rather than trying to compete with even like with the like try to compete in the same way that the USSR tried to compete with the US, covering the world. No, like this is not the way. Like, it's better to look inwards, and probably the US, while the focus was in the Middle East, in the Asia, in European Union. Then like they say, like, okay, now we have a strong competitor just across the ocean, and we need to deal with it. So probably it's very good strategy change when you look inwards, and I hope that other big powers will do the same in a way.
Thank
But
you.
that's the issue. But I don't think looking inwards is going to be of any help. They cannot establish those factories that have been established in China.
When I say look inwards, I'm not saying stop the economic activity. I'm not saying that. When I say look inwards, is like prioritize internal problems rather than building your external influence somewhere in different regions.
Yes, and those internal problems are that there is a growing problem with joblessness, right? So what you're saying is that you want to bring back those jobs into the States where labor is more expensive, where there are other markets outside of the US that have developed more efficient ways of dealing with challenges around manufacturing. So I don't think that it is viable for the US to bring all these things back. And that is so antagonistic to the isolationist policies. You need to do all your manufacturing outside of the US, whilst at the same time, you're isolating your would-be partners. I think that is why I'm saying it is really too late to look back inwards. It's just
I
a downward.
disagree. I disagree. I think that's exactly why we need to do it. I agree with our comrade here. I think the U.S. absolutely, that's exactly why we need to do it now. So again, the U.S. has built up this massive empire, sprawling empire of over 150 military bases, all of these entangling alliances, military commitments, $800, $900 billion a year defense budget. We don't need any of that. Let's cut that out. Focus internally, invest that money internally, pay down this debt. If it means raising tariffs, and it will get more expensive, that's obviously could kick up inflation. But we need to be focused on what's going on inside the country. To your point, the country's falling apart.
That's a very good point, Michael. So that means...
So cut the alliances, cut out all this. Do we need these things?
Cut military spending. Are you doing that? No, you're cutting on cancer research. You're cutting on... those initiatives that gave you soft power. But has there been any initiative to cut down on military?
There was a thing that came up. There was a statement, wasn't there, about a call to the US and the US, Russia, and Europe and China just to go into reducing military spending.
Nobody's going to do it.
No, it was just, but it was out there. It was interesting to your point. Seems to suggest actually that somewhere that is coming into the debate because it's another big thing about, the US can't afford what it's doing globally right now. It's got 26 trillion of debt. It's creaking.
I think it's 34.
Or 30, whatever it is. I mean, it's too much, right?
Yep.
And they also probably can't afford the military, which is also part of the problem. They can't sustain what they've had previously. They've got to start sort of pulling back, which again comes to this point about, think about it in terms of peak power. When would you say, has the US hit peak global power yet? Or do you think it's in the future, in the past? I think it's in the past. Chinese peak power, I don't think it's reached, and Indian certainly hasn't even started. And I think that's the bigger picture, which is behind a lot of what's really going on right now. And to come back to Trump, yeah, he's a catalyst. But is this Trump making this? Absolutely not.
But this is so much of why I support Trump. I think you need to destroy the empire to save the country. So the U.S. empire, I agree, is in decline. It cannot sustain the commitments it's made, which is why, again, I think the right wing and particularly the MAGA folks were saying, why are we taking on an additional commitment in Ukraine when we can barely take on the commitments we have? Can we defend Taiwan against the Chinese if we've agreed to do that? Question mark. Can we defend Europe against a Russian invasion? Yeah, sure, in principle, but do we want to be? And then, therefore, if we cut all that out, now you can cut out the military budget because you don't need this massive apparatus to protect half the globe. You can then say, let's cut half that defense budget and let's cut the soft power and let's focus on saving our money and building up our stuff at home. I think you have to do that. Otherwise, we're going to drown.
But this is not happening, Michael. Like this is what they are announcing, but it's not happening on the ground. Because if you look at the Ukrainian situation, for example, or that despite all the scene, all what we've witnessed recently, there's still deployment of U.S. troops in Eastern Europe.
We still have 80,000 troops in Europe.
What I see is what's happening is redeployment and not withdrawal. And this means that there will not be like any national savings actually that will have positive impact on the internal situation in the U.S. It's only redeployment, shifting in priorities. We have, I think, again and again, is China.
That's why they're rushing so much, because like obviously like one term for 4 years will not be enough to reshape the strategy. How much time did it take to withdraw the troops from Afghanistan? I think it was years and years and years.
Obama started talking about it, and it took about 10 years.
10 years,
to actually do it.
Yeah, exactly. So if we're changing the European security infrastructure, for example, then of course it will take like years and years and years.
Sorry, Vlad, are you calling for a third Trump term? Is that what you're doing right now? 4 years isn't enough? Is that...
No.
Have you gone MAGA just from this conversation?
I said 4 years is not enough. I haven't said a word about Trump.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. I thought maybe there was a MAGA convert at the table. Okay. To the global impact in your individual regions, obviously most of the world is represented at the table. North America, Europe, Africa, Middle East, and then Eastern Europe we'll consider maybe its own category. What do we think the impact of this, everything we just described, the American pullout more or less, the changing American policy where it is changing and maybe other areas where it's not, the rise of China, how do you see that impacting your individual region and then maybe more broadly for the world? But what are your guys' thoughts?
Well, I've already said, like, being a Middle Eastern, I think the U.S. priority at the moment requires stability in the Middle East, which is for us. I mean, this is sort of like somehow positive. I don't want to be very romantic and expect that it will be like paradise, but certainly because the people in the Middle East are exhausted. And I think it's time to have a little bit of rest, looking forward to further develop their countries and establish some peace. So I think the American strategy pertaining to Middle East is kind of positive.
So Trump means stability in the Middle East, you would say?
They need it. They need it. Like in order for them to shift on other priorities, they need to stabilize the region.
Yeah, I think from an Africa perspective, what we're going to see a lot more is initiatives towards self-reliance. You started seeing people like Burkina Faso kicking out the French water company Veolia. You saw Ghana starting to process its own cocoa and manufacture its own chocolates rather than sending it to Switzerland and then buying the processed food back. We've seen it in Kenya processing its own tea and coffee. So I think there's going to be an increased focus on how African countries can start building capacity to rely on themselves. You can start seeing that regional hubs that were previously never cooperating, for example, in terms of trade, will start cooperating more, whether it is SADC and the East African Community and the West Africans. We are going to see a lot more economic cooperation, because I think it is very clear, and like I said, there's a generation that is now much more enlightened and thinks that our parents made huge mistakes, right? Relying
Partnering
on
with
the
the
West.
Americans.
I mean, I'm being unfair here, Michael. I'm saying Americans, but it's generally, if anything, Europe has been worse to Africa than the Americans have. It's just that we're talking about American policy here. But I think that is going to be the focus, and the disquiet on the ground is going to bubble over, and we might see governments topple. Or if that doesn't happen, then we'll certainly see increased awareness and voting by young people.
And what would the change be? That's an interesting thought. What would that change be if governments were changed in Africa? Would that be towards a more pro-Chinese government? Would that be like, what are the implications behind that as well?
Yeah, it would certainly be towards China, right? Because I think the Chinese have always been more pragmatic in investing in Africa, right? They've positioned themselves as being partners, and I'm not saying that they necessarily are partners, but they've positioned themselves by saying, hey, we'll build the deep sea port in Lekki in Nigeria that will enable you to refine your own petroleum. You will not need to send that out and then buy it at a more expensive price. So that's
Didn't they build that railroad from the high speed from Nairobi to Mombasa, something like that?
So that's the standard gauge railway. That's $4 billion that they lent Kenya. There was $3.2 billion to build the widest highway in Nairobi, at one of the northeast towns. So there's going to be a leaning towards China, and that is what the Americans are going to lose out on. This soft power, where the Chinese get first priority in terms of whether it is extraction of minerals or first opportunity to invest in the continent.
So that could be what happens in Africa. It's just that, they go from sort of feeding at the American, being dependent on the American trough, and then it just becomes the Chinese one. I'd be kind of sad if that's what happens, in my opinion. I'd love to see Africa use it as an opportunity to start developing their own networks and their own coalitions as a community independently of, a big foreign sort of donor, if you like. But who knows? I think it's definitely it's creating a very interesting time for them. And I see it from South Africa's point of view. I was listening to the budget speech today. That's how exciting my life is. It was the budget speech in South Africa, and I actually put it on the YouTube and was listening to it, and listening to the problems they've got with the aid money that's gone and how they're going to sort of fill gaps and things. So it's creating issues. Let's hopefully Africa will go the right way, and stand on their own feet, so to speak, and find a path forward that way. But who knows? In the Europe's case, I mean, I see it very much as like Europe's just been asleep at the wheel for decades. I mean, they've been living this kind of, sort of lazy, bloated lifestyle, just sort of letting Americans lead the way on everything, not having to worry too much about anything, taking care of their own affairs. It's a massive welfare state. I mean, the amount of, European resources they spend on welfare, it's just unsustainable. And now they've got a really big problem, huge problem. They've got to find a way to sort of really step up, sort themselves out, come over their infighting that they've always been able to get away with. I did my PhD in European political studies 25 years ago. And I was studying then about how they were using language in politics to always fight their own corners, and they couldn't agree on anything. Nothing's changed since. But they can't carry on like that. I mean, I think you made the point, Michael, Vlad, that, they love fighting. They can't. They've got to come together. They've got to find ways to start toughening up. And it's a reckoning, I think, for Europe right now. Assuming that what's happening, the shifts that are happening are permanent. I personally think they are. I don't think you go backwards. And I think the sort of swim lanes and tram lines of global geopolitics go in one direction only, and this is the way they're moving. They don't turn around and go the other way. So assuming that's the case, these shifts are permanent, and Europe's got to face up to it. And it's gonna have a big impact. I think it could shake up the job markets. It could shake up the welfare state. It could really shake up the dynamics of politics across the whole continent.
I think it will shape like the whole European Union, like the structure of the European Union. Remember, when we were talking about the perspectives of European Union, you said there will be no EU. I said there will be new EU. So I think this shift of America, looking in a different direction from the European Union, I think it will just
Speeds it all up.
Yeah, it will speed it up, and I think actually this will be a good catalyst for the change, and I still now I'm even more confident in my view that I think it will be in new EU. They will have to reshuffle it. They will need to make the decision whether they are the states of Europe or they are in European state. So what is this?
Look at Britain, for example. I mean, Britain, it's very interesting right now to see what's going on in UK politics. You can see them moving more closer to the EU. I mean, for the last 20 years, they've been going the other way. You can see it happening. I mean, whether that's, who knows how it'll play out, but to your point, I mean, I think it could go that way.
Right.
Yeah.
And these countries will really consolidate.
Of the EU.
It's
their common interest.
That's true, yeah. It's a moment of reality check for Europe.
It's funny because Vlad says, and I think maybe, Paul, you're agreeing that this validates his view on the EU. It validates mine, as far as I'm concerned. So we just come to two different conclusions. I think, particularly in the Europe case, I think the Africa case is very interesting. That seems to be the future geopolitical battleground. Who's going to get the best deals?
This will be the focus of economic focus and political focus in the upcoming decades. We will all be looking at Africa. 100%.
The rare earth metals that Africa has, the capacity to impact global supply chains, all that stuff.
Fastest growing continent, youngest generation, the youngest population, fastest growing population, fastest growing GDP. Everything is the number one in terms of the rates.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think on the Europe part, this is where I think you guys, particularly you Europeans, and I'm now counting you in the European basket, you guys have faith that they're going to unify. I just don't. Their history bears out it doesn't
But they don't
work.
have to unify, Michael. This is the point. They don't have to unify and completely integrate. They only need to agree on priorities and cooperate and collaborate.
They can't even do that?
And collaborate
That's true.
for serving their purposes and their priorities. The U.S. provided them with a motive. No.
Absolutely. But this is my point. I just think, the next couple of years, the next 5 years, maybe that's going to be the question mark. How does it go? What's going to happen? I say it's going to collapse. You say it has a new future. Let's see. Thanks everybody for tuning into another episode of the Culture Clash podcast. If you like our content, subscribe to us on YouTube, like our posts, follow us on TikTok, Instagram, and X. And with that, we'll speak to you in 2 weeks.